slice as pain, not with the specially designed dextroamphetamine she had racing through her veins right now. But she'd probably feel the strangulation.
Get up.
Hello there, and welcome to the golf
The weight
club.
lifted off her back,
We're starting
and
you
she was
off
drawn
on
up by her
par
wrists.
4 here.
She got her feet under her as quickly as possible to take the pressure off her shoulder joints. She needed to keep her arms usable. He stood behind her, but she could tell by where his breathing came from that he was tall. He pulled her wrists until she was on her tiptoes, struggling to maintain contact with the floor.
Okay, shorty. Now you're gonna do something for me.
Ugh.
She didn't have the training to beat him in a fight,
Up to you.
and she didn't have the strength to wrest herself free. She could only try to make use of the options she'd prepared. She let her weight sag precariously against her stressed shoulders for 1 second as she kicked the toe of her left shoe down with enough pressure to pop the stiletto blade out of the heel. The front-facing blade was in her right shoe. Then she slashed awkwardly back toward where his legs had to be. He jumped out of the way, loosening his grip enough for her to rip free and spin around, her right hand flying out for an open-handed slap. He was too tall. She missed his face, and her barb scraped against something hard on his chest. Body armor. She danced backward, away from the blow she could hear coming but could not see, her hands extended, trying to make contact with unprotected skin. Something cut her legs out from under her. She hit the ground and rolled away, but he was on top of her at once. He grabbed her hair and bounced her face against the concrete again. Her nose popped, and blood flooded her lips and chin. He bent down to speak directly in her ear.
Playtime is over, honey.
She tried to headbutt him. The back of her head connected with something, but not a face. Uneven spires. Metallic. Night vision goggles. No wonder he'd been able to control the fight so well. He slapped the back of her head. If only she'd put her earrings on.
Seriously, stop it. Look, I'm going to get off you.
Yeah, way to start things
I can
out.
see you, and
Nice
you
little
can't
par.
see me. I've got a gun, and I will shoot you
Okay, let's
in the
put this
kneecap
ball
if
out
you try
there.
one more stupid trick. Okay?
While he was talking, he reached back with one hand and ripped her shoes off, one after the other. He didn't check her pockets, so she still had the scalpel blades and the needles in her belt. He jumped off her. She heard him move away and clicked the safety off his gun. "What do you want me to do?" she asked in her best frightened little girl voice. The split lip helped.
Now that was
She
a
imagined
swing.
her face was a sight. It was going to hurt like hell when the drugs wore off.
Disarm your booby traps and open the door.
"I'll need..." Sniff, sniff. "The light on."
No problem. I'm switching my night vision goggles for your gas mask anyway.
She dropped her head, hoping to hide her expression. Once he had the mask on, 90% of her defenses were rendered obsolete. She limped, too theatrical, to the panel by the door and turned the light on. She couldn't think of any other option right now. He hadn't killed her immediately. That meant he wasn't under direct orders from the department. He must have an agenda here. She had to figure out what it was he wanted, and then keep it from him long enough to gain the advantage. The bad news was that if he needed the door open, it was probably not just to have an easy escape route. It meant he had backup, which didn't help her odds. Or Daniel's. A voice in her head added. Like she needed more pressure. But Daniel was here because of her. She felt responsible for him. She owed him. When she turned, blinking against the brilliance of the overhead lights, the man was 20 feet from where she stood. He had to be 6'3" or 4", and the skin on his neck and jaw was definitely white, but that was all she could be sure about. His body was covered with a black one-piece suit, almost like a wetsuit, but rough, with jutting plates of Kevlar. Torso, arms, and legs all armored. He looked pretty muscular, but some of that could be the Kevlar. He wore heavy all-terrain boots, also black, and a black watch cap on his head. His face was hidden by her gas mask. Over one shoulder was slung an assault rifle, a Macmillan .50 caliber sniper. She'd done her homework. It wasn't hard to become an expert on just about anything when you spent all your free time studying. Knowing gun makes and models could tell her a lot about an assailant, or any suspicious man on the street who might be planning to become an assailant. This assailant had more than one gun. A high-standard HDS was holstered on his hip, and a Sig Sauer P220 was in his right hand, pointed at her knee. Right-handed, she noted. She had no doubt he could hit her kneecap from this distance. Given that particular rifle, she figured he could probably hit her wherever he wanted, from however far away he wanted to. He reminded her of Batman, but without the cape. Also, she thought she remembered something about Batman not ever using guns. Though if he did, assuming taste and skill, he would probably choose these. If she couldn't get this assassin out of the gas mask, it wouldn't matter how many super soldier friends were waiting for him outside. He would have no trouble killing her once he had what he wanted.
Disarm your leads.
She feigned a brief dizzy spell as she limped over to the barn door, trying to get as much time for thinking as possible. Who would want her alive? Was he a kind of bounty hunter? Did he think he could sell her back to the department? If they'd put out a contract on her, she was sure that all they would have asked for was her head. So, a blackmailer / bounty hunter? I have what you want, but I'll release it alive back into the wild unless you double the reward. Smart. The department would definitely pay.
No good. Okay,
that
so
was
you're in
the
the rough
best
here.
guess she could come up with by the time she was to the back edge of the door. The system wasn't complicated. There were 3 sets of leads for each area of ingress. The first was outside in the bushes to the left of the barn door, hidden under a thin layer of dirt. Then, there was the trigger line that ran across the seam where the door opened, connected loosely enough to pull apart with the slightest breach. The third was the safety, tucked under the wood paneling beside the door. Its exposed wires were separated by an inch of space. The current was only stable if at least 2 of the connections were linked. She wondered if she should make the process look more convoluted than it actually was, but then decided there was no point. All he'd have to do was examine the setup for a few seconds to understand it. She wrapped the ends of the third lead tightly together and then stood back. It's off. She made her voice crack in the middle of the words. Hopefully he would buy that he'd knocked the fight out of her.
If you would do the honors,
he suggested. She gimped her way to the other side of the door and then pulled it back, her eyes already on the spot in the darkness where she assumed the dark heads of his companions would be.
Okay, let's see if you can
There was
save
nothing
par
but the
here.
farmhouse in the distance. And then her eyes dropped, and she froze. "What is that?" she whispered. It wasn't actually a question for him, it was just shock breaking through her facade.
that
He answered in a tone that could only be described as obnoxiously smug.
is 120 pounds of muscles, claws, and teeth.
He must have made some kind of signal. She didn't see it. Her eyes were locked on his backup, because the animal darted forward to his side. It looked like a German shepherd, a very big one, but it didn't have the coloring she associated with Alsatians.
And that is for par.
This one was pure black. Could it
And
be a
that'll
wolf?
keep you at 1 over for the round.
Einstein.
He said to the animal. It looked up, alert. He pointed to her,
Okay, it's time
and
to
his
send
next
this
word
ball
was
on its
obviously
way.
a command.
Control.
The dog, Wolf, rushed her with its hackles rising. She backed up until the barn door was against her spine, her hands in the air. The dog braced itself, snout just inches from her stomach, its muzzle pulled back to expose long, sharp white fangs. A low, rumbling growl began deep in its throat. Intimidate would have been a better name for the command. She thought about trying to get one of her barbs into the dog's skin, but doubted they were long enough to make it past its thick fur.
Sweet.
And it wasn't
And
like
we're
the thing
putting
was going to
from
sit there and
about
let her pet
28
it.
feet out.
The Batman wannabe relaxed a bit, or she thought he did. It was hard to be positive about what his muscles were doing under the armor.
All right. Now that we've broken the ice, let's talk.
She waited.
Where is Daniel Beach?
She could feel the shock on her face, even as she tried to suppress it. All her theories whirled around again and turned upside down.
Answer me!
She didn't know what to say. Did the department want Daniel dead first? Make sure the loose ends were all tied up neatly? She thought of Daniel, exposed and unconscious in the center of the tent, not exactly a strong hiding place, and felt sick. Batman stalked angrily toward her. The dog reacted, moving to the side to allow the man through, even as its snarl grew in volume. The man shoved
so
the barrel
that'll
of his
keep
Sig
you
Sauer
at
under her
1 over
jaw,
for the round.
roughly, knocking her head against the barn door.
If he's dead,
Fifth hole
The man
coming up.
hissed.
you're going to wish you were too. I'll make you beg me to kill you.
She almost snorted. This thug would probably hit her a few times. Maybe, if he had any creativity, he would cut her up a bit, and then he'd shoot her. He had no idea how to generate and maintain real pain. But his threats did tell her something. He apparently wanted Daniel alive. So they had that one thing in common. Resistance was counterproductive at this point anyway. She needed him to think she was out of the game. She needed him to relax his guard. And she needed to get back to her computer. Daniel's in the tent. She pointed with her chin, keeping her hands raised. He's fine. Batman seemed to consider this for a moment.
Okay, ladies first. Einstein,
He barked.
heard.
He pointed to the tent. The dog barked in response and moved around to her side. It poked her thigh with its nose, then nipped her. "Ow!" she complained, jumping away. The dog got behind her and poked her again.
Just walk slow and steady to your tent thing, and he won't hurt you.
She really didn't like the dog
Great
behind
contact.
her,
Nice
but she
swing.
kept her pace to the injured hobble she'd been faking. She glanced back at the animal to see what it was doing.
Don't worry,
Batman said, amused.
people
31
don't
feet to
taste
the
very
hole.
good. He doesn't want to eat you. He'll only do that if I tell him to.
She ignored the taunt and moved slowly to the curtain access point.
Hold that open so I can see in.
He instructed. The tarp was stiff with the layers of egg foam. She rolled it back as far as she could. It was mostly black inside. Her computer screen glowed white in the darkness, the monitors dull green. Because she knew the shapes, she could make out Daniel under the blanket, just a foot off the ground, his chest rising and falling evenly. There was a long moment of silence. "Do you want me to turn on the lights?" she asked.
Hold it there.
She felt him come up behind her, and then the cold circle of the gun barrel pressing
And
into the
that'll
nape
keep
of
you
her
at
neck,
1 over
just
for
at
the
her
round.
hairline.
What's this?
He murmured. She held perfectly
All
still
right,
while his
let's let
gloved
her rip.
fingers touched the skin next to the gun. At first, she was confused, but then she realized he had noticed the scar there.
Huh.
He grunted, and his hand dropped.
Okay. Where's the switch?
On the desk,
Where is the desk?
about 10 feet in, on the right side, where you can see the computer screen. Would he take off the gas mask and put on the goggles again? The pressure of the gun disappeared. She felt him move back from her, though the dog's nose was still pressed against her
Heading
butt.
for the green here.
A slithering noise hissed across the floor. She looked down and watched the thick black cord for the closest work light
22
whip
feet
past
from
her
the
foot.
cup.
She heard the bang when it fell over, but no crunch of glass. He dragged the light past her, then flipped the switch. For a fraction of a second, she allowed herself to hope that he'd broken the light, but then it flickered to life.
Control.
He commanded the dog. The snarling started again, and she held herself very still. Aiming the light in front of him, he stepped into the tent. She watched the wide beam sweep the walls, then settle on the form in the middle. He moved into the room, sliding into a sinuous gait that was totally silent. Obviously a man of many skills. He walked around the body on the floor, checking the corners and probably looking for weapons, before he focused on Daniel. He crouched, removed the blanket, examined the bloody restraints and the IV, followed the sensors to the monitors,
Okay, so that'll
and
keep
then
you
watched
at
those
1
for a
over
moment.
for the round.
He put the light down, angling it at the ceiling to get the widest
Coming
spread
off
of
a
illumination.
par on the last one. Let's
Finally,
see what happens
he
here.
reached down, carefully removed the gas mask from Daniel's face, and set it on the floor.
Danny.
She heard him whisper. Chapter 8. Batman ripped the black glove off his right hand and pressed 2 fingers to Daniel's carotid. He bent down to listen to Daniel's breathing. She examined her attacker's hand. Pale skin, fingers so long they
Solid
almost
swing.
looked like they had an extra joint. They looked familiar. Batman shook Daniel's shoulder lightly and asked louder,
Danny?
He
Looks
sedated.
like,
She volunteered.
I'd say around 110 yards
His
or
face
so to the
jerked
pin.
up toward her, and though she couldn't see it, she could feel his glare. Suddenly, he was on his feet, launching himself at her. He grabbed her arms and yanked them over her head again as he shoved his masked face into hers.
What did you do to him?
He shouted. Her concern for Daniel's safety evaporated. Danny was going to be just fine. The one she needed to worry about was herself. "There's nothing wrong with him," she said calmly, dropping the injured
Looks like
damsel
you're
routine.
gonna hit some sand
He'll wake up
here.
from the sedation in about 2 hours, feeling fine. I can bring him around sooner if you want.
Not likely.
He growled. They had a staring contest for a few seconds, one she wasn't sure if she'd won or lost. She could see only her own face in the reflective mask.
Okay,
He said.
let's get you situated.
In a smooth move, he had her hands behind her back, wrists held tight in his gloveless right hand, probably holding the gun in his left. He marched her into the room, toward the folding chair by the desk,
And that'll
she
keep
went
you
along
at
docilely.
1 over for the
The
round.
dog's hot, heavy breath was close, following right behind. She was
Coming off
almost
a par on the
70%
last
sure
one.
she
Let's see
could
what
twist
happens
her
here.
hand into a position that would put the left barbed ring against his skin, but she didn't try. It was a risk, but she wanted Batman alive. There was a large hole in her picture of what was going on, and Batman would have at least some of the answers she needed. She carefully nudged the covers over the barbs again. She didn't resist as he sat her, none too gently, in the chair. He pulled her hands in front of her and zip-tied them together.
I feel like you're the
Solid
kind of person
swing.
whose hands I want to keep an eye on.
He muttered, as he bent down to secure her ankles to the chair legs. All the while, the dog's face was
Looks like we're
directly in
about
front of her
220
own,
yards out.
eyes unblinking. A few drips of warm drool fell onto her sleeve and soaked through. Gross. He zip-tied her elbows to the chair back and stood up, towering over her now, dark and menacing. The long, silenced barrel of his HDS was just a few inches from her forehead. "The switch for the overhead lights is right there." She jerked her chin toward the power strip on the back edge of the desk. 2 standard outdoor extension cords were plugged into it. He stared in that
Great
direction,
contact.
and she imagined he was eyeing the switches warily. "Look, anything that can kill you is going to kill me first," she pointed out. He grunted, and then leaned away and punched the power button. The lights flared overhead. Suddenly, the tent looked less threatening. With all the medical equipment, it could have been a medic's tent in a war zone, except for the torture implements on the tray, of course. She saw his face orient toward them now. "Props," she explained. She felt the glare again. He whipped a look back at Daniel, naked and clearly intact on the table. His focus swung back to her.
What's the flashing light?
He demanded, gesturing to the little black box with the keypad. "It's telling me the door is unarmed," she lied evenly. In fact, the box wasn't hooked up to anything. It was just a nice red herring to distract from the real trap. He nodded, accepting that, then leaned over to look at her computer. There were no open documents, no files on the desktop. Her background was just a pale geometric design, little white squares on a faintly darker gray field.
Where are the keys?
He jerked his head toward Daniel.
And
Taped
that
to the bottom of the
performance
desk.
brings you down
He seemed to be
even
eyeing
par.
her again
Not
through the
bad.
mask. She willed herself to look calm and compliant.
9th hole coming up.
"Take it off. Take it off. Take it off," she prayed silently. He kicked her chair over. She held her neck tight as her left arm and thigh smashed into the ground with bruising force. She was just able to keep her head from hitting the concrete again. She wasn't sure if she was already concussed, and she really needed her brain working right. He grabbed the back of the chair and yanked her upright.
Nice.
In his right hand, he held the keys. That wasn't necessary, she said.
Einstein. Control.
Growling in her face, more drool
And
on her chest.
we have about...
Batman turned
I'd say
away and quickly
140-ish
unlocked
yards
Daniel's
from here.
shackles.
What's in the IV?
Saline in the top one, nutrients in the lower.
Really?
Sarcastic.
What happens if I pull the tubing out?
He'll need a drink when he wakes up, but don't use the water bottles on the left side of the mini-fridge outside the tent. Those are poisoned. He turned, pulling the mask off his head so he could glare at her more effectively, yanking the sweaty watch
that was
cap
a
off
swing.
at the same time. Yes. She kept the relief off her face as he dropped the mask on the floor.
You've changed your tactics.
He noted
All right, this
sourly,
next one's for
running
Birdie.
his free hand through his short, damp hair.
Or are the ones on the right really the poison bottles?
She looked up at him calmly. I thought you were someone else. And then she really looked at him. She didn't have the resources to keep her face from reacting now. All the theories spun around again, and a bunch of things fell into place. He smirked, realizing what she was seeing. So many clues she'd missed. The pictures that were Daniel, but at the same time, weren't. The holes in the file on Daniel's history, the missing photos, time, dates, birth dates, the easiest small changes to make if you wanted to hide something. Daniel's strange reticence to believe what he was seeing when he looked at the spy images. His struggles with loyalty. Those long, long fingers. Other Daniel, she whispered. The smirk vanished. Huh? She blew out a breath and rolled her eyes. She couldn't
And with
help it.
that, you
It was all
will
too much
stay
like
at
one
even
of her
par.
mom's ridiculous soap operas. She remembered the easiest
All right.
small changes to make
Put
if
this
you
in the
wanted to
fairway.
hide something. Daniel's strange reticence to believe what he was seeing when he looked at the spy images. His struggles with loyalty. Those long, long fingers. Other Daniel, she whispered. The smirk vanished. Huh? She blew out a breath and rolled her eyes. She couldn't help it. It was all too much like one of her mom's ridiculous soap operas. She remembered the frustration of every holiday she and her mother had spent together, the afternoons lost to the incredibly slow-moving, implausible dramas.
Nice swing.
No one was ever really dead. Everyone came back. And then there were the twins. Always with the twins. Batman actually didn't look that much like Daniel, as far as identical twins went.
Okay,
Daniel's
looks like we have
features
around
were refined, his
155
aspect
yards to
gentle.
go.
Batman was all hard angles and tightly gripped expressions. His hazel eyes seemed darker, maybe just because his brows were pulled down, putting them in shadow. His hair had the same color and curl, but was cropped close, the way she would expect in an agent. Judging from his thicker neck, she would guess Batman had the gym musculature to Daniel's sports build. Not immensely bulky, or he wouldn't have been able to pass for his brother in the pictures, just harder, more defined. Kevin Beach, she said in a flat voice. You're alive.
Very nice.
He sat on
Okay,
the
for
edge of her
birdie.
desk. As her eyes followed him, she didn't let them rest for even a second on her computer's clock right by his elbow.
Who were you expecting?
There were a few options, all of whom would want both me and your brother dead. She shook her head. I can't believe I fell for this.
For what?
Daniel's never even met De La Fuentes, has he? It was always you. His face, which had begun to relax, was suddenly guarded again.
What?
She nodded to the photographs scattered on the floor. He seemed to notice them for the first time. He leaned over to examine one, then bent down to grab it. Then the one underneath, and the next. He crumpled them in his fist.
Where did you get these?
Compliments of a small department working for the American government, entirely off the books. I used to be in their employ.
And
They asked
that'll
me to
keep
freelance.
you at even par.
His face
Nice.
contorted in outrage.
This is highly classified.
Let's have a
You
nice
wouldn't
drive out on
believe
this
my
one.
clearance level. Back in her face, he grabbed the front of her t-shirt and lifted her and the chair a few inches off the ground.
Who are you?
She kept herself calm. I'll tell you everything I know. I got played, and I'm about as happy about it as you. He set her down. She wanted to count in her head, mark the time, but she was afraid he would notice her distraction. He stood over her, arms folded.
What's your name?
She spoke as slowly as she thought she could get away with. It used to be Dr. Juliana Fortis, but there's a death certificate with that name now. She watched his face to see if any of this information meant something to him. It didn't, as far as
tree
she
got
could
in
tell.
the way on that one.
I operated under the direction of the department. It doesn't have another name. It doesn't exist, officially. They worked with the CIA and some other Black Ops programs. Interrogation specialists. He sat back down on the edge of the desk. 3 years ago, someone decided to dissolve the department's 2 key assets, namely me and my mentor, Dr. Joseph Barnaby. Still no recognition. I don't know why, although we had access to incredibly sensitive information. And I'm guessing something we knew was the motive. They murdered Dr. Barnaby and tried to murder me. I've been running ever since. They found me 4 times. 3 times they tried to have me assassinated.
Solid
The
swing.
last time, they apologized. His eyes were narrowed, evaluating. They told me they had a problem and they needed me. They gave me a stack of files on the De La Fuente situation and named your brother as his collaborator. They said that in 3 weeks, Daniel would be spreading the supervirus across the American Southwest. They told me I had 3 days to find out where the virus was and how to stop De La Fuentes from implementing his plan. He was shaking his head now.
They told you that much?
He asked in disbelief. Counterterrorism was always the main component of my job. I know where all the warheads and the dirty bombs are buried. He pursed his lips, making a decision.
Well, since you already know the details, I guess it's not a huge breach of policy for me to tell you that I shut down the De La Fuente situation 6 months ago. De La Fuente's death is not common knowledge. What's left of the
12th hole
cartel is
coming up.
keeping this
Take your
quiet,
best shot.
so they don't appear vulnerable to the competition.
She was surprised at the relief she felt. The weight of knowing that so many people were doomed to painful execution had been heavier than she'd realized. Yes, she breathed. That makes sense. The department wasn't that cold-blooded, apparently. They'd used a nightmare catastrophe to motivate her, but they weren't messing around with civilians still in danger. And the serpent?
Did you get all of
He
that?
looked at her blankly. Sorry, department nickname. The domestic terrorists?
My associates bagged 2 of the 3 ringleaders and took out the entire southern chapter. No survivors.
She smiled tightly.
You're an interrogator,
He said in a suddenly icy voice.
a torturer.
She lifted her chin. Yes,
And you tortured my brother for information he didn't have.
yes. The very initial phases, at least. He backhanded her. Her head snapped to the side, the chair bobbled, and he shoved it down with 1 foot.
You're going to pay for that.
He promised. She worked her jaw for a second to see if anything was broken. When she
And
was
with
satisfied that
that,
nothing was
you
seriously
will stay at
compromised,
even
she
par.
responded. I'm not positive, she said, but I think that's why they did this
here
to
we
him.
go.
Why they fed me this whole elaborate story. Through his teeth.
What reason?
They haven't had the greatest success in killing me. I guess they thought you would get the job done. He clenched his jaw. What I don't understand, though, she continued, is why they didn't just ask you to do it. Or order you, I suppose. Unless you're no longer with the CIA? She guessed. The gun had been the giveaway. From her research,
Great
she was pretty
contact.
certain that
Nice
the
swing.
HDS was the gun most commonly carried by CIA agents.
If you didn't know about me, how do you know where I work?
Okay,
demanded.
you're in the rough, but at
About
least you
halfway
aren't
through
in
his
the
question,
real deep
she
stuff.
saw the bright white rectangle in her peripheral vision go black. Trying to be inconspicuous, she sucked in the deepest breath through her nose she could manage.
Answer me!
He growled, raising his hand again. She just stared at him, not breathing. He hesitated, brow furrowed. Then his eyes went wide. He dove for the mask on the floor. He was out before he hit the ground. Another thump. The dog collapsed into a puddle of fur beside her chair. Under testing circumstances, she'd once held her breath for 1 minute and 42 seconds. But she'd never been able to repeat the feat.
Great contact.
Usually she ran out of air at about 1:15, still way above average. Lung capacity had become a priority in her life. This time, of course, she hadn't been able to hyperventilate beforehand, but she wouldn't need a full minute. She hopped her chair over to Batman's inert form and pushed herself forward, bracing her knees against his back. With her hands secured in front of her, it was easy-ish. Kevin Beach had left Daniel's gas mask on the floor. She hooked it with one finger and then tilted the chair back until all 4 legs were on the ground. She leaned her face as close to her hands as she could and slipped the mask over her head, pressing the rubber rim tight to her face to create a seal. She blew out her air in a big whoosh, clearing the chamber, and then took a hesitant breath. If some of the chemical had lingered, she figured she still would be okay. She'd built up a decent resistance and would not have been out as long as the others, but it was especially nice to have such a big head start. She scooted to the desk and rubbed the zip tie around her wrists against the edge of the scalpel on her props tray. It popped quickly against the pressure she was generating. It was easy work to slice the rest of the ties, and then she was free. First things first, she reset the screensaver on her computer to come on after 15 minutes of inactivity. She couldn't lift Batman, sprawled face down on the floor beside his brother, but his arms and legs were close enough to Daniel's that she could use the restraints that had been around Daniel's left wrist and left ankle to secure Kevin's. He'd thrown the key carelessly on the table by Daniel's
Sitting
side.
at 1 over for
She
the
pocketed
round.
it. She didn't re-secure Daniel. Maybe it was a mistake, but
Okay,
she'd
it's
already
time to
done
send
so
this
much to
ball
him
on
it
its
just
way.
felt unfair. And underneath it all, she wasn't afraid of him. Another potential mistake. She stripped Batman of his guns and removed the cartridges and firing pins from the rifle and the HDS. She put the safety on the Sig Sauer and tucked it into the back of her belt. She liked it. It looked more serious than her PPK. She went out to the barn stalls to find her PPK and then shoved it in beside the
Nice.
Sig Sauer. She was more familiar with her own. Better to keep it handy, too. She found her shoes, stashed the other guns, and then grabbed the mover straps on her way back into the tent. The dog was too heavy
Looking
to move
at
easily, so
125
she wrapped the
yards
straps around it and
ish
hauled it
to the
back to the
pin
bunk
here.
room. At first, she simply closed the door and walked away. Dogs didn't have opposable thumbs. A moment later, though, she changed her mind. The dog's name was Einstein. Who knew what it was capable of? She looked for something to drag in front of the door. Most of the heavy machinery was bolted down. After a few seconds of thought, she walked around to the silver sedan. It just fit between the tent and the stalls.
Nice
She pulled
swing.
it right up to the bunk room door, wedged the front bumper tight against the wood, and then put it in park. She threw the parking brake on for good measure. She closed the barn door and rearmed it. A quick look outside told her that it was almost dawn. Back to the other Daniel. The bat suit was a chore to remove. The fabric between the Kevlar panels was thick and ribbed with fine cables, almost like gristle. She snapped 2 blades on it before finally quitting at his waist. She settled for peeling back the top half and patting down his legs, which didn't have as much Kevlar to disguise them. She found a knife holstered in the small of his back and one shoved into each boot.
All right,
She
12-footer
pulled
here.
his socks off. He was missing the pinky toe on his left foot, but he had no other weapons that she could find. Not that he'd need any if he got his hands on her again. His whole body was roped with lean, hard bands of muscle. His back was a mess of scars, some from bullets, some blades, and one bad burn, with one more telling scar under the edge of his hairline. He'd removed his tracker, too. Definitely no longer with the CIA. A defector? A double agent? But how had he found his brother?
Nice putt. You're in the hole.
She remembered the droning of the noisy prop plane, the booming
Okay, so that'll
thud
keep
of the
you
improvised
at 1
crash
over for the
landing.
round.
Someone in a hurry, she thought. Someone for whom time
Coming
was
off
the
a
biggest
par on
problem.
the last one. Let's see what happens
She turned
here.
to look at Daniel. It seemed another examination was in order. She'd done a more thorough job going over his back, so she looked closely now at his stomach, groin, and thighs. Something she should have done before, but she'd misread the situation badly. It was the idea of time, the hurried way Batman had arrived and attacked, that pointed her toward what she was looking for. An ordinary tracker would indicate only where the subject was, and Daniel wasn't really that far from home, not far enough to cause his dead brother to panic and run in, guns blazing. So this tracker must monitor something more than just location, and it would have to be placed in the right spot. She wanted to kick herself when she saw it, the little red tail of a scar sticking out from the edge of the tape she had used to secure the catheter tube against his leg. She pulled the tape now. Always better to do that when the subject was still under anyway, and then removed the catheter. He'd be getting up soon. The scar was tiny, with nothing raised under the skin. She figured the device must be more deeply implanted, next to the femoral artery, no doubt. When his blood pressure had gone crazy with the first round of interrogation, or maybe even from his fear when he'd first woken up, it must have tipped off his brother, and whoever else was monitoring him. The tracker would have to come out. She had enough time before he woke up, so she got her first aid kit. After snapping on some gloves, she numbed the site and sterilized the scalpel. Good thing she hadn't broken all of them on the batsuit. She scrubbed the skin with iodine, then made a quick, neat incision on top of the old one, though a bit longer. She didn't have forceps or tweezers, so she just poked around carefully with one finger on the inside and one on the outside. When she found the device, a little capsule about the size of a throat lozenge, she was able to pressure it out fairly easily. She cleaned up the site and then superglued the edges together. After that, she treated the raw skin on his wrists and ankles, cleaning and bandaging everything.
Wow,
Finally,
you hit that green
she put the blanket
and
over
under
him
regulation.
and got him the pillow.
You can sink the next putt.
The
We'll
capsule
be cooking
she
with
left
gas,
to cool
I'll tell you.
on the steel table. To anyone watching the tracker on a monitor, it would appear that Daniel Beach had just died. She had a feeling that his death wouldn't bother anyone in the department. She had a better sense of the other side's plan now, and she was pretty sure it wasn't all about her. She exited the tent to attend to her own face, first wiping off the blood and then trying to determine the extent of the damage. The lip was swollen, and the tear needed a stitch. She applied a drop of superglue. Her cheek was missing a few layers of skin, and she was going to have a matched set of very pronounced black eyes. Her nose was swollen and crooked, so she took advantage of her current painless state to push it back into shape as well as she could. The pain would return fairly soon, though she'd given herself the maximum dose of the drug she'd privately named Survive. It wasn't meant to work long-term. It was just for making it through an attack like the one she'd just endured. Kind of like the adrenaline her body naturally generated, just much more powerful, and with some opiates to block the pain. Survive wasn't on the books. Her list of duties had not included creating anti-torture concoctions, but she'd thought it might be something she'd need someday, and she'd been right. This wasn't the first time she'd used it. She'd overreacted to those earlier assassination attempts, but it was the first time she'd actually suffered through a decent beating with Survive in her system. She was pleased with its performance. She didn't have anything to stabilize her nose with, so she would have to try to be more careful with her face for a while. Luckily, she was a back sleeper. The face was going to be a problem.
17th hole coming up.
She couldn't exactly walk into a grocery store right now and escape notice. When she had done everything she could think of to do, she lay on the cot for 10 minutes, just gathering her strength, or what was left of it. The drug still made her feel strong, but she knew she'd sustained some damage. There would be repercussions to deal with. She needed time to rest and heal. Time no one was going to give her. Chapter 9. She decided to wake Daniel up.
Breathtaking.
Once Batman came around, which he probably would in about 15 minutes or so. The conversation was not going to be very genteel.
I'd say
She wanted a
like
chance to explain and apologize
the
before the shrieking and the death threats started. She reset the protocols on the computer. The chemical mixture in the air had long since dispersed, so she didn't need the gas mask inside the tent anymore. She grabbed the other mask, then tucked both sets of straps through her belt, keeping them close. She pulled Daniel's IV first. She didn't want him tethered to anything at all when he woke up. He'd had enough of that. His veins were still looking good. It was easy to inject the solution into the antecubital fossa of his other elbow. She sat on the edge of the table beside him, so close to the floor that her knees were up by her shoulders, and waited. He came to slowly, blinking against the overhead lights. He raised one hand to shade his eyes. Then awareness hit. He stared at his hand, free, bandaged, and then his eyes darted around the bright room.
Alex?
He asked quietly. Right here. He turned toward her gingerly, moving his legs under the blanket, checking to see if he was still bound.
What is happening now?
He asked cautiously, his eyes still struggling to focus. I believe you, and I'm very sorry for what I did to you. She watched him process that. Carefully, he raised himself up on one elbow, then clutched at the blanket, realizing again that he was naked. It was funny how non-medical people reacted to that. Physicians were fairly relaxed about nudity in general. She felt exactly the same about nudity as any other doctor, but he wouldn't assume that. She should have put on her lab coat.
You do believe me?
He asked. Yes.
Well, at least
I
you're on
know
the
you're
green.
not the
That
person
is
I thought
always
you
good.
were.
Let's see if we can save power on this
misled.
putt.
He sat up a little farther, moving warily, waiting for something to hurt. He should feel fine, though, just tired from the muscle spasms. And his upper thigh would be a little sore when the local wore off. He started, and then froze.
What happened to your face?
It's a long story. Can I say something before I get into it? His expression was full of concern. For her? No, that couldn't be right.
Okay.
He agreed hesitantly. Look, Daniel, what I told you before was true. I don't like hurting people. I didn't like hurting you. I only do that when I think the other option is much more horrible. I have never in my life done this before.
Okay, 1 under for the
Hurt
round.
a totally innocent person. Never. Not every person I've been asked to interrogate was as depraved as the rest.
Let's let her rip.
All of them were at least part of the plot. I've long since realized that my old bosses will stoop to almost anything, but I still can't believe that they set me up to interrogate someone entirely guiltless. He thought about it for a few seconds.
Are you asking me to forgive you?
No, I'm not asking for that. I would never ask for that. But I wanted you to know. I never would have hurt you if I hadn't truly believed it would save lives. I am so sorry.
And what about the drug dealer? The virus?
He asked anxiously. She frowned. I've received some new information. Apparently, De La Fuentes was taken care of.
No one is going to die?
Not because of a weaponized virus spread by a drug czar. No.
So that's good, right?
She sighed. Yeah, I guess that's the silver lining of what happened here.
Now will you tell me what happened to your face? Did you have an accident?
Again with the concern. No. My injuries are related to that new information I mentioned. She wasn't sure how to break it to him.
Unlucky.
Sudden indignation. His shoulders tensed.
Somebody did that to you? On purpose? For hurting me?
His mind certainly didn't work like someone in her line of business. Things that would be obvious to anyone who had ever worked on any facet of a mission were totally foreign to him. Essentially, she answered.
Let me talk to him.
He insisted.
I believe you too. I know you didn't want to do it. You were trying to help.
That's not really the issue. Daniel, you know when I was showing you those pictures before and you recognized the person in them, but you didn't want to tell me who it was?
Heading towards the beach here, not the good
His
kind.
face closed up.
Beach to
He nodded.
beach, not the
You
happiest
can relax.
of times.
I'm not asking you to confess anything. This isn't a trick. I didn't know you had a twin. They covered that up in the file so I wouldn't...
No. But it wasn't Kevin.
He interrupted.
That's what I didn't understand. It looked just like him, but it's impossible. Kevin is dead. He died in prison last year. I don't know who it could be unless we were actually triplets, and I think Mom might have noticed that.
He trailed off, watching her expression change.
What?
He asked. I'm not sure how to tell you this.
Tell me what?
She hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked around the table. His eyes tracked her. Then he sat up, bunching the blanket carefully around his waist. She stopped and looked down. His eyes followed hers. Kevin Beach's face was turned toward the table where
Well
Daniel
done.
sat.
1 under par
It was
to end
curious
things
how
here.
much more